welcome to episode 255 of The Dive Down, a Magic the Gathering podcast focused on the latest decks, trends, and strategies for the casual spike. My name is Stanislav, here in Chicago, still home for the holidays, and on the line with, I guess, from the spikiest part of central North Carolina, returning to the show, CCR, Chris Castro-Rappel. Hello.
Hello. Yeah, I guess we don't identify like the spikiest geographical location, although perhaps like during podcast recording, it's like my office and Lee's office is probably the spikiest spots. So yeah, I guess that makes sense.
So those are 2 points. Like, how do we triangulate? What's the tri-city of spikiness between your two offices?
I mean, like, not to get metaphysical or anything, but I feel like when you're speaking with somebody remotely and you're connected, I think that location kind of gets united in a way. So I would say that it's kind of like that single, the nexus is the conversation and the connection between the two spots and the two people. So that's going to be the spikiest location. And right now, you know, we're all in the spikiest, although neither of you are in North Carolina. Like, you know, technically speaking, I think you are the spikiest locations in North Carolina right now.
Okay. Well, we'll chew on that for the next 90 minutes. Also joining us from the yeehaw capital of the world, Austin, Texas, it's my new friend Scott, a.k.a. OafMcNamara. Hey, Scott.
Hello. You know, I'm not really one for a yeehaw, but I'll drop a howdy every once in a while. I'm not afraid to drop a howdy here and there. It's a nice, friendly way to say what's up. You know, even if you don't have much of an accent, a howdy is still a nice, friendly Southern greeting, you know?
You are wearing the most comically large cowboy hat I've ever seen in my life. A 20-gallon hat, at least.
I wanted to really dress up for you today. We're talking about Phoenix, got to get excited. 20-gallon hat it is.
Yeah. Is that a Stetson? Is that like a $2,500 hat?
That's proprietary information. I can't get into that. Sorry.
So I think Chris needs no introduction, but in case you've not heard of Scott / OafMcNamara, our current Pioneer Trophy leader, also a esteemed Pioneer Phoenix grinder and innovator.
I think important to note probably that Scott, did all of those trophies come with Phoenix, or were there a couple other?
Almost all of them. Yeah, I think probably aside from maybe one or two. I think. Yeah.
Okay.
When the new set just dropped, was it Wilds of Eldraine that had the new land, the Rainbow Land for creature types? I think I played elves immediately and 5-0'd with elves right out the gates. And then I 5-0'd with that, and then I didn't touch it again. So I think that it might literally be all Phoenix except for that first one. Yeah.
So on this week's show, we have come full circle on the dive down, and we return to the deck that kicked off this podcast 5 long years ago. We are once again diving into Izzet Phoenix. And sure, we don't have Faithless Looting or Manamorphose or Lightning Bolt or Thought Scour, but those are always the worst cards in the deck. We don't need them. We don't want them. We want Chris. We want Scott. And we're going to talk about one of the hottest decks in Pioneer at the moment and one that's very near and dear to our 3 hearts. But before all that, some housekeeping. So I do need to take a moment to talk about heavy play card game accessories. They are my favorite deck box and playmat and dice box. They're designed to improve your gameplay and your game day, and I think I've been a noticeably better Magic player ever since I've started using these accessories. The playmats, the deck boxes, even the card sleeves, they're all designed with these enhanced ergonomics. They provide additional mobility and protection, and honestly, my cards have never felt safer. I used to put them in a thick metal vault, but I actually think the magnets on the EquipMag system probably do more to protect the cards in like a beautiful ergonomic compartment than, you know, the bank vault that I used for my Magic cards, comic books, and expensive wines ever could. Using Heavy Play's unique EquipMag magnetic system, you can attach your dice box, your deck bundles, your playmats all into a single unit, so they're super easy to carry around, whether you're at the RC or the local game store or playing pickup games outside of the movie theater or while you're in line for Aquaman something or other. And if you use the promo code, the Dive Down 2023, you'll also get 10% off your order over at heavyplay.com. If, maybe you don't like shopping online, maybe your credit card got stolen, you should reach out to your LGS. Perhaps they carry it, and if they don't, maybe if you demand it from your LGS, they'll start to carry it too. So check it out, heavyplay.com, promo code the Dive Down 2023. You're gonna love it. We got no new patrons, no increased tiers, no new reviews since our last episode because, wait a second, actually, that's not true. I think we got a patron today. Let me pull that up really quick. Bear with me, uno momento. Yes. So we do have one new patron to join the Dive Down Nation, just 6 short hours ago. It's Maxon. Welcome to the Dive Down. If you'd like to support the show, you can do so over at patreon.com/the Dive Down. Even $1 an episode gets you into our super secret Discord where you can talk to me, you can talk to Shane, you can talk to Dave, and dozens of other friends and fans and Magic players, and even not Magic players who just want to hang out because it rules in the Discord. So find that at patreon.com/the Dive Down. Another way to support the show is using our store at thedivedown.com/store. Probably too late to get something for Christmas since this episode is coming out after Christmas, but blame it on the mail. Get a loved one a beanie and say, I got this for you in Black Friday, but it just took forever for the mail to arrive. Here's a beanie. I know you're going to love it. And I'm sure your friends and family will love the Dive Down beanie. It's warm. It comes in lots of different colors. Dave designed the art. What's not to love? Another way to support the Dive Down, of course, is with Mana Traders using promo code the Dive Down 23. That's the number 23. Gets you 10% off your first 2 months of renting Magic Online cards over at Mana Traders. Makes you a better Magic player, whether you're playing Phoenix or other decks in Pioneer or other formats altogether. Check out Mana Traders to get all of your MTGO cards. Gotta mention Barrister and Man. Their promo code, the Dive Down 23. That one's spelled out. It's a long one. You're spelling out 23. I'm not going to spell it for you. Spell check can help you with that if you don't know how to spell 23 yourself. I don't know. That gets you 10% off your first order over at Barrister and Man. Wait, it's not even 10% off. It's 15% off. What am I saying? Check it out. Smell better. You'll be happier for it. Lots of fragrances for whatever your style or your aesthetic is. Hand soaps, body soaps, beard soaps, and shaving soaps. They also have colognes, beard oils. Barrister and Man rules. We love having them as a sponsor, and I think you're going to love having their fragrances on your body. All right. Should we jump into the episode now?
Before we jump into anything, though, I do want to point out that this is a deck that is functionally and in positioning and even in archetype completely different from modern Phoenix. So if I think it behooves you when you're playing matches with this deck to not think about it. If you were a modern Phoenix player, it's not that sort of tempo game. Generally Izzet Phoenix is a control deck in Pioneer in a way that it simply wasn't in modern, where you had your punk you out with 2 Phoenixes early lines. You had Thing in the Ice to try to turn 5 you lines and stuff. And this is a different game entirely that we're playing here.
So Scott, did you play the modern deck as well?
Very briefly. I love Pioneer, and that love has honestly kept me from diving into other formats as much lately. So the short answer would be no. I mean, very little, maybe a league or two, back when that deck was a little bit popular, but it's mostly been all Pioneer Phoenix all the time for me.
Yeah. So Chris, that's an interesting observation because what are the substantive differences between the two decks? Pioneer has Treasure Cruise and worse removal. Modern had the best cantrips in the format in the form of Faithless Looting, Serum Visions.
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of have hit the nail on the head. Phoenix in Pioneer is a Treasure Cruise deck. Phoenix in Modern was an Arclight Phoenix deck, and also kind of a Thing in the Ice deck. And the whole kind of purpose of the deck was to begin pressuring your opponent as quickly as possible. And then if they had removal spells, you would get your card advantage by returning Phoenixes to play. If they didn't have removal spells, then you could easily be attacking for 10 or 13 on turn 3. And that was kind of the pressure you were putting your opponent under, which was very important to do in Modern. And in longer games, your card advantage came pretty much exclusively from cantripping and getting Phoenixes back. Whereas the Pioneer deck, leans very heavily on, obviously, Treasure Cruise as its card advantage engine. You do get Phoenixes back, but they don't quite start affecting the game as early, and we're not a turbo thing in the ice deck either. So your opponent's life total goes down a lot more slowly for the Phoenix deck, but that's kind of in Pioneer, but that's kind of okay because you draw so many cards each game. You're playing a different plan entirely.
Yeah. All right. So guys, in your opinion, what is Phoenix? Like, is it mid-range then? Is it tempo? Is it turbo xerox? Whatever that is. Like, Chris, the way you're describing it is that it's a control deck that then just turns the corners with Phoenixes. But, you know, control decks haven't been cantripping decks in a long time. Like, blue-white isn't playing opt or consider, etc. They play memory deluge, I guess. How would you categorize Phoenix and at least like what makes it unique?
Sure. You know, I was glad Chris kind of took the brunt of that to start, labeling it a control deck, because I was leaning towards control deck as well, but I was worried I was getting a little too cute with my definitions, because it is very different than other control decks in the format, right? Like you mentioned, it has cantrips, it has a lot of proactive spells, it has a 2-drop creature, which is a little bit unorthodox for a control deck. But I think that on the whole in Pioneer, it does play out like a control deck. You said that the removal spells are a bit worse here than they are in Modern. But comparatively, I think that Phoenix gets to play some of the best removal spells in Pioneer. Of course, they're much worse than they are in Modern, but Lightning Axe and Fiery Impulse are kind of the best removal spells that Red has to offer, and it just so happens that they work perfectly with the Arclight Phoenix package. I had difficulty labeling this deck into any of the categories, mid-range, tempo, control, combo, cleanly, because it does have aspects that can play out like any one of those. You can have aggressive draws. It makes it feel like an aggro deck where you play a Shredder on 2, return a Phoenix on turn 3, and then you're getting in there quickly. It plays out like a control deck, like Chris mentioned, where you have so much removal spells and card advantage. You're just kind of controlling the board, waiting to turn the corner. And, even some of the versions with Temporal Trespass and Galvanic Iteration, which I'm sure we'll get into, kind of makes it feel like it's got a combo finish as well. So I could hear an argument for any of those categories, but I think that Chris was right to label it a control deck first and foremost.
And really, like, an anti-creature deck is almost the sort of, I don't know, like sub-archetype that it is. It's a control deck that is particularly good at trading up on mana for creatures, because Fiery Impulse trades for basically every 1, 2, or 3 mana creature in the format, and then Lightning Axe trades for Shield Druid for 1 mana. So it just, it's the deck that gets to play Terminates for 1 mana, and that's where it butters a lot of its bread.
So in terms of just like the main game plan, here's how I think about playing Phoenix and Pioneer. I'm curious if you guys agree or disagree. The first 2-3 turns are all about just like A, removing creatures, or B, setting up your eventual Phoenix play. It's just like really about planning the head, keeping things under control for the most part on board, but making sure that your card quality is so high, and preferably higher than opponents, that when you want to turn the corner and start turning creature sideways, you have the clear to do that and you don't have to worry about any obstacles. So your cantrips are not just there to activate Phoenixes, but they're there to kind of like get your hand into the position it needs to be so that you can pretty much do what you want on the turn that you want to. And the fact that like the deck rewards you for playing 2 to 3 or more spells per turn, that's almost kind of like secondary to the fact that it's about just like having the best cards in hand at any given time and using your cantrips to get there.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, one of the main draws to Phoenix is that unlike other control decks is you're very proactive in sculpting your hand. And so you can keep a hand with 4 cantrips, a Ledger Shredder, and 2 lands, and it's like this hand could be anything. This hand could be whatever I want it to be, at any given moment. And so you can just spend those first couple turns sculpting your hand for more removal spells. That's what you need. More threats. That's what you need. Maybe you're just sticking for a Treasure Cruise, so you can pull ahead and get value off all these cantrips that you're putting into your graveyard. It's just an excellent. It's unique as a control deck in that it's very proactive in the first couple turns of the game, where you actually do get to spend all your mana every turn sculpting your hand and getting set up for that mid game where you turn the corner.
Nice. All right, so let's look at deck construction from a high level, and then go a little deeper into like play patterns and best practices. We talked about the cantrips. They are the biggest part of the deck, but The threats, I think, are really what define Phoenix against other control decks, if that's what we're labeling it as. We have the titular Arclight Phoenix as your primary win condition, especially in game one. But you also have Ledger Shredder, which is this dual role of hand smoother, Phoenix discarder, and then eventually it becomes a threat. I try to hold my Ledger Shredders until turn 3 when possible, because this deck isn't great at getting Phoenixes out on 3. Like, it's near impossible. Maybe you can do 1 or 2 if you have early Lightning Axes and Phoenixes in hand, and then enough Cantrips to do it on 3. But otherwise, like, because you're playing a longer game on average, I find that like getting premium value out of Ledger Shredder before it eats a Fatal Push or something else is kind of like generally going to get you a minor edge. Do you guys think about it the same way?
So that's super matchup dependent. There are a number of matchups where running the Ledger Shredder out on turn 2 is going to be a lot higher upside. But as you said, like Fatal Push is like kind of the main consideration there. If it's a Fatal Push deck, then I'm probably holding this Ledger Shredder until at least I can get a connive out of it. Or ideally, like often I'll hold a Ledger Shredder for several turns until I draw the Phoenix and get a discard that I actually want out of it, and then it eats a Fatal Push, but I got the value that I needed. But in a lot of matchups where the opponent is the one pressuring you, then you want to run that Ledger Shredder out. Or if there's a mana-based consideration, you know, if even playing against Rakdos, my opponent goes Blood Tithe Harvester on 2, I kill it at the end of their turn, there's a decent chance I just want to play my Ledger Shredder on turn 2 because my opponent's 3-mana spells are their proactive 3-mana spells are so powerful. And now they have to choose between casting a 3-mana spell and letting me untap with a Ledger Shredder, which might just end the game on the spot effectively, or killing my Ledger Shredder and not being able to play a Graveyard Trespasser or a Fable of the Mirror Breaker that turn. Because you know, I agree that it's not always the easiest to get a Phoenix back on 3, but with the additional cantrip of Sleight of Hand now, it happens more often, and untapping with a Ledger Shredder, like, virtually guarantees that the first Phoenix will be in play at the end of your third turn. So there's definitely a lot of consideration. And then against decks with, like, very little removal, like against Amalia game 1, you just want that Ledger Shredder in play as soon as possible.
Yeah, there's a shocking amount of proactive decks in Pioneer that just really don't have ways to kill it, you know? So, like Chris mentioned, Amalia or Convoke is another great example where it really is important to get that out on turn 2. Because Stan, like you mentioned, it's really difficult to get a Phoenix into play and get that going as early as turn 3, but Shredder is one of the few ways where you can let that happen. And so, yeah, it is matchup dependent. It's situational dependent, you know, Phoenix, because you don't have Faithless Looting, the Pioneer Phoenix deck really does sometimes struggle to get that Phoenix out of your hand. Shredder is, I think, the best way to do it, along with Lightning Axe. But, you know, you're right, there's a lot of matchups where your Phoenixes, or your Shredders die pretty often, and they don't have a ton of convenient targets for Lightning Axe. And so saving that Shredder until you can get at least one connive out of it can definitely be the difference between having a functioning hand and not.
And then the newest creature to enter the deck, like in the last year, I think this was printed this year, Picklock Prankster. 1 in a blue, 1/3 flying fairy that has an adventure where you mill 4 cards, and then a fairy or instant/sorcery that was milled this way can go back to your hand. So once again, like, this is a great way to get Phoenixes in your yard, but then you can cast it for 2 at instant speed. The adventure, by the way, is also an instant, but you can also flash in the fairy. Right? Am I remembering that correctly? The fairy has flash as well?
No, it does not have flash.
Oh, okay. Just Brazen Borrower. My bad.
Flying and Vigilance are the two.
Oh, that's what it is.
Abilities on that thing.
Yeah. But then it's a 1/3 flying Vigilance. Great card. Not the best threat. Like, it'll get you some points, but such an important addition to the deck. Like, it's, I think, next to Ledger Shredder and Lightning Axe, it's kind of like made getting Phoenixes in the yard like way reliable, so that you don't have to play, if you don't want to, Otherworldly Gaze or Izzet Charm for that matter.
Pieces of the Puzzle is the one that it replaced.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like I can let Scott talk about this sort of, because coming to this conclusion was an adventure. And I think we like independently arrived at like, yes, we want Picklock Pranksters, which felt good to have that confirmed. But yeah, I think Scott, I definitely want to hear your take on. Oh yes, Picklock is the one that we want.
For sure, you're gonna have to stop me probably because I had so much to talk about with Picklock over pieces. When Picklock got printed alongside Sleight of Hand, it kind of got shoved under the rug in terms of obvious additions to Phoenix. Everyone was kind of excited to try out Phoenix again because of Sleight of Hand, and Free the Fae, Picklock Prankster wasn't really discussed as too much of an option. I think I'll shout out Devin, or aka Doomwick here. I think the first person that brought the cards to my attention was Doomwick in one of his spoiler review videos where he discussed the possibility of maybe Free the Fae going into Phoenix. I wasn't totally convinced. One of the things about Free the Fae and Picklock Prankster, it doesn't read particularly strong. When you read the card for the first time, it doesn't sound like a very exciting card. Like it's the fact that it doesn't draw 2 cards is kind of a big deal. I know that's one of the things that people really like about pieces of the puzzle. And it wasn't until the RC cycle that the European RC cycle, I forget exactly where that was or when that was, sometime after Wilds of Eldraine got printed. I know I started to see some of the Phoenix decks that did well incorporate just a few Picklock Pranksters, into their list, which surprised me because again, it doesn't read super, like a super strong card. But I figured I'd give it a try. I went for the full 4, cut all the pieces just so I could draw it as much as I could, just so I could see it in action. And I'll tell you what, after that first league, I really never went back. The fact that it's cheaper is a huge deal for a lot of reasons that we'll get into. The fact that it's instant speed means that your sideboard counter spells get a whole lot less awkward. That was kind of one of the awkward things about Phoenix, is you play 5 or 6 counter spells in your sideboard, but you primarily want to act as a sorcery speed deck. So the fact that it's instant makes your sideboard playing a lot less awkward. And to my surprise, the Picklock Prankster half, the body, 1/3 flying vigilance, ended up being far more relevant than I could have imagined. The fact that it's just a free spell sitting out there to cast on turns where you wouldn't otherwise be able to trigger Connive for your shredders. The fact that it has vigilance means that it races really well. It double blocks really well. I've just been so impressed by Picklock Prankster that there's all sorts of arguments that you could have to try and convince someone to play Picklock Prankster over pieces of the puzzle in their Phoenix deck. But all of those arguments don't really matter, because all you need to do if you're not convinced is just to try it like one time, and then you'll be totally convinced that this is just a better fit for the deck.
I mean, I agree. It's convincing. I've only picked up Phoenix and Pioneer within the last month or so. I had never really liked it in the past. I tried to play it because I always loved the modern deck, and I guess maybe I hadn't put 2 and 2 together that the modern Phoenix deck was just a fundamentally different deck. It was always just a gut feeling to me that something was off with Pioneer. Been playing it for the last month or so and just kind of like falling in love with it all over again. By the time I picked it up, everyone had moved on to Picklock Prankster, and the benefit I think is really evident for all the reasons you said, like being able to play at instant speed, having just like a flying vigilance body to both block and like get in some chip damage. I think other than Phoenix's, the Picklock Prankster is one of your best sources of reach, since your red spells don't do additional damage. And like if you're low on birds or people are like finding a way to exile them against control, for instance, like having just some way to just deal like bits of pressure here and there just becomes really important, I think, over the course of a match, really. So good find, Devin and Scott.
Yeah, I'll certainly give Devin the credit for that one. But I just want to touch on what you mentioned there, Stan, is in the games that get a bit messy, in the games where maybe they're using Graveyard Hate to get rid of your Phoenixes, or you just kind of have an anemic draw where you're not able to pressure them much, that's when having the 1/3 body is really nice, because suddenly you have 2 of those things in play. You hard cast the Phoenix and boom, you're getting in for 5 in the air. You got some good double blocks for their man lands, and it's like, man, this is, and again, it feels like a total free roll because you're playing the card for the spell half, but just incidentally you get this awesome body that helps you race in the late game.
Well, awesome is maybe going
no,
but it is nice to get it for free.
It's in the threat section here, Chris. We're going to talk about it as a threat.
I have you know, in a game where I got get losted twice and then I just had 2 picklock pranksters in my adventure zone and was like, oh, okay. And then I ended up with like a 3-5 and a 2-4 picklock prankster. And that was they're very real a lot of the time, but those were monsters.
Those ones were awesome. Yeah. And just real quick, just to continue to touch on picklock prankster before we move on, the fact that it's cheaper seems like a really obvious thing, but it makes the deck better in so many ways, and it speeds up the deck by a turn in a lot of instances. So we mentioned how it can be difficult to get a Phoenix back as early as turn 3. Picklock Prankster is one way that can happen, where you free the Fae on turn 2, happen to get lucky, mill a Phoenix, and you're off to the races as early as turn 3. But also as you go later into the game, and you start double and triple spelling, turn 4, for example. Turn 4 might be an awkward turn if you want to cast pieces of the puzzle, because you can mill a Phoenix and maybe another spell you're not going to be able to triple spell, but Free the Fae lets you do all of that in one turn and really use all your mana every single turn, which is really what the Phoenix deck is trying to do.
This is also, and I know I'm getting ahead of ourselves, but that turn 4 Free the Fae as your first of 3 spells is kind of a critical turn for the deck a lot of the time. And it's one of the things that convinced me, like, oh yeah, Izzet Phoenix is the right build and Dimir is not, because that turn 4 where you like picklock prankster or you free the Fae, find a removal spell, cast a cantrip, and cast a lightning axe discarding a Phoenix is like something that you want on turn 4 quite a bit. That's one of the goal turns that you have. And when you have Bitter Triumph costing 2 mana, then that turn becomes a lot more difficult. That becomes a turn 5 sequence, or just like something that you're not really triple spelling with the card that discards your Phoenix as easily. And I know, like, we'll get into this later in the episode, but that's one of the things that like hyper efficient sequence of spells involving a lightning axe was one of the things that was just very, very important to convincing me, like, yeah, you want the red mana in the deck. This is how to build it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things I really appreciate about Free the Fae, it almost never whiffs. Just like the fact that you're only playing 18 lands by and large. I think in most of these decks, I'm only seeing 18 lands. Does that sound right to you guys?
Yeah, that's a little bit of a point of contention with the deck. 17 to 18 lands plus a couple of the spell flip lands is pretty common. So those are extra hits off the picklock, which is great. But yeah, generally about 17 to 18 lands.
Whether you get birds in the yard or not, like having only 12 threats, 4 of them being Prankster, which Prankster gets back, I just feel like I can count on one hand how many times I freed the Fae and ended up with nothing. And there's a chance that that's never happened, and perhaps my sample size isn't large enough yet, but like it's just so consistent, so reliable. You always like find at least something to do and it replaces itself. And even if it technically doesn't replace itself, like it's filled the yard for treasure cruise while also drawing you a 1/3 flyer that you can then play whenever you're ready to do that. So
I will say I did have a wild turn this RC where I cast my first Free the Fae of the turn and it hit 3 Phoenixes and a land, and that, which is okay, fine. I'm like okay with this. We hit 3 Phoenixes. My second Free the Fae, however, only hit lands and a Crackling Drake, which was problematic because I did have a spell, but it was a lightning axe for a creature that I didn't care about killing, discarding the last card from my hand, brought back 3 Phoenixes, but then my opponent just like stomped 2 of them and I had nothing left and lost that game. So,
but it is worth noting that it feels bad when you miss off the Free the Fae, but it's a lot easier to hit 1 spell in the top 4 cards than 2 spells in the top 5. So again, making that comparison to Piece of the Puzzle, which is really the point of contention that a lot of Phoenix players still aren't totally convinced by, that you definitely have a fail rate less often because you're only getting that 1 card. So
yeah, every time you cast Pieces of the Puzzle and you hit 1 opt, you just kind of want to die.
Right.
Let's touch on the additional threats really quick. Some of these are post-board threats. Others are like 1s and 2s that you might see main. Crackling Drake, I think, is pretty consistent across most sideboards. At least 2 of them. I've seen some people play up to 4. I find that this card is just fantastic when people are pressuring your graveyard because it kind of doesn't care, and if it hits the board, it's always at least replaced itself. I don't know that it's good enough to play game 1 in a Phoenix shell, but I bring it in a lot because I'm like shaving on some number of graveyard matters cards.
Yeah, I mean, I think Crackling Drake is one of the best sideboard cards in Pioneer, really, in terms of how it fits into the Phoenix shell. You're a very graveyard-centric deck, game one. And what happens games 2 and 3 is your opponent will bring in some graveyard hate, of course. And it does two things to your deck. It makes it so your threats aren't as potent. It's hard to get Arclight Phoenixes back consistently with graveyard hate keeping you down. And it also makes Treasure Cruise difficult to cast as well. And so what you're looking for in your post-board threats are threats first and foremost, right? You want to be able to kill your opponent when your Phoenixes aren't really working. But you also want them to be somewhat value-centric because your Treasure Cruises are kind of getting pressured as well. Against the decks that are hurting your graveyard, they're generally playing a resource game and trying to keep you down that way. So Crackling Drake just fits in so perfectly as this like threat/value engine kind of rolled into one. It's just a perfect sideboard card for the deck.
You guys remember Thing in the Ice?
Nope.
How the Mighty Have Fallen.
That's right.
I think I've like seen post RC some people like start to be Thing in the Ice truthers again, maybe because of Amalia specifically, but why, like, is Fatal Push the reason Thing in the Ice got bad and the rise of Rakdos? What happened there?
I think there's a lot going on. I mean, in Pioneer specifically, Thing in the Ice was mostly a tech anti-mono green card that would just allow you to end the game a little more quickly and hopefully keep them off of having a bunch of devotion. Sometimes they just like would replay all of their stuff the turn after you bounced it because Nykthos is, kind of not a real Magic card. But that's kind of what it was for. I do respect the trying to find something else for the Amalia matchup, and I think Thing in the Ice could be part of it. One thing that is so tough is that in that matchup specifically, you can't you don't kill them with Phoenixes as easily as you kill other people with Phoenixes because they gain a bunch of incidental life. You don't always want to just cast a bunch of spells during your main phase, so they can be kind of hard to get back, and they're not that good defensively once their guys are, if they've explored a couple of times, if their Wild Growth Walker is a 2/4. There's just like a lot of ways that the Phoenixes aren't the best threat against Amalia. So most of the sideboard plans involve taking out some or all of your Phoenixes, and then you need your juke threats. Crackling Drake, if you can find a place to land it against Amalia, does its thing. It's suspend one, destroy target player. But a lot of times if you draw 2 Crackling Drakes against Amalia, you might as well scoop. You just can't get them into play. So I have been interested in finding some, spending some of the sideboard juke threat slots on cheaper threats. I think Young Pyromancer is not that bad there because it keeps you from dying to the random 1/1 attackers after you've paid 3 life for ward 3 or 4 times. So that's a possibility. Brazen Borrower is okay, but doesn't kill all that fast. Not that Young Pyromancer kills all that fast. And so maybe Thing in the Ice could be a thing that kills a little more quickly. And when you flip the thing, you're probably not going to die, but you might just die right after you flip the Thing in the Ice. Amalia is a hell of a Magic deck.
Yeah, well, I'm sure we'll get more into the matchups down the road and talking about Amalia specifically because that one had a really big weekend and is worth discussing. But yeah, I'm not expecting to see a whole lot of Thing in the Ice in these decks moving forward unless you got some niche sideboard tech maybe for Amalia like Chris was talking about. A lot of people for a while were just main decking all their Thing in the Ices and not playing Shredders instead. That's something that you see was very popular when Mono Green was around. And that, like Chris said, is great against Mono Green. But I think that when you do that, you kind of introduce some structural problems with the deck where Shredder not only is a great 2-drop, but it's an important slot as a discard outlet in the deck. And, without Faithless Looting and without Shredder, it's pretty difficult to get enough of those ways to get your Phoenixes out of your hand. And so for me, even when it was kind of enticing to play Thing in the Ice when Mono Green was popular, it wasn't really much of a choice. It was, Shredder needs to be in the deck as a discard outlet for structural reasons.
Yeah, and you see the way that these decks are built when somebody has decided my 2-drop is Thing in the Ice. Okay, yeah, you can do that, but then you have to run multiple Izzet Charms in order to have the discard outlets. And so I think you're kind of, it's a one step forward, one step back kind of thing. You're not really improving your deck that much because you're just putting multiple of this very clunky effect into the deck. Izzet Charm is just not that good of a card.
No. Perfect one of, I find. Whenever I draw the 1 I'm just like, okay, I'm going to find some use for this, but anything more than that, it just, I think it kind of gets in its own way.
Yeah.
I'm discarding Izzet Charms to Izzet Charms, and Spider-Man's pointing at himself. So before I forget, Chris, did you say that you're taking some, if not all, of your Phoenixes out in the Amalia matchup, or is it a different matchup? What's going on there?
Multiple matchups, but generally matchups where the Phoenixes aren't actually... So against a deck like Rakdos, which has not that much life gain, no flying blockers or anything, and they're trying to grind you out, even though they have a fair amount of graveyard hate, your Phoenixes are just really real threats. They just keep dealing damage. They keep coming back over and over again, and your opponent just gets battered by them and kind of feels that pressure all game long. Against a deck like Amalia, where they're gaining a couple of life each turn, and you put a 3/2 flyer into play, sometimes it almost doesn't matter. You put 2 3/2 flyers in play, okay, that's good, but it might take 5 turns to kill your opponent with those 2 3/2 flyers because they gain quite a bit of life. Now, if they have 2 mana confluences in play, that is a different story. But there are just matchups where if the recursiveness of the Phoenixes doesn't matter at all, and they don't pressure your opponent in as meaningful a way as they do in other matchups, then you have to start looking at them as like just not the best threat possible. And to me, Amalia is one of those matchups. I think against I played against Angels in this RC, and I think you just immediately cut all of your Phoenixes against Angels because that body is meaningless in that matchup. So you need to be thinking about are these 3/2 recursive threats worth it in the matchup? Most matchups, yeah, that's why there's a deck called Phoenix in the format. But some of the matchups, it's just not the thing.
I have to say, I have not fully bought into this line of thinking, Chris. I haven't fully committed and just cut all the Phoenixes in against Amalia, for example. But I mean, your logic makes a ton of sense. It's just hard to be brave enough to actually pull the trigger and do that. It's.
I'm not confident cutting all of the Phoenixes is 100% right. I think that was that idea for me originated with Julian Henry, I think. And I kind of accepted it and it seemed okay. But I think maybe having a couple in is still fine. I don't think you want the full playset in post board, though. Totally
on board with trimming Phoenixes in a lot of matchups for sure. But it could be right. It just feels scary to not have any of them in post board,
It also makes your lightning axes measurably worse when you have no Phoenixes. And so when you're incentivized to cast a lot of lightning axes the way you are against such a creature heavy deck as Amalia, it is really costly to take all of your Phoenixes out. So that's one thing that, I am not sure about.
Okay, we'll dive into the Amalia matchup a bit more down the road, I'm sure.
Okay, let's get closer to that conversation by touching on the next section, which is just cantrips. The deck is playing, I think, upwards of 20 cantrips if you include Treasure Cruise in that camp, but we have Opt, we have Consider, we have Sleight of Hand. These are usually 4-ofs, but I see Sleight of Hand as a 3-of sometimes. And then I see Otherworldly Gaze sort of come and go depending on who's playing the deck. Chris, you gave a pretty impassioned defense of Otherworldly Gaze on Grindcast recently about how helpful it is not just to have another 1 mana cantrip, but to set up Treasure Cruises. I've been playing Otherworldly Gaze whenever I play Phoenix and Explorer because we don't have Temporal Trespass. And the thing I really like about Otherworldly Gaze is that it's awesome on your draw step, either as flashback or not, just to make sure that you're increasingly likely to actually draw something really good in a way that because we don't have Serum Visions to set up future draws, Opt and Consider and Sleight of Hand, they don't set you up for future turns in the same way that I think Otherworldly Gaze actually plays really well with multiple cantrips, whether or not you have a big Phoenix turn. Scott, where are you at on Gaze these days?
Chris, I know Chris knows. He's laughing at me now. I don't think I have a great argument against Otherworldly Gaze. I mean, listen, it's a great game 1 card. Phoenix thrives when it's able to use all its mana every turn on just casting spells, casting cantrips, just ripping through your deck. And Otherworldly Gaze lets you do that, albeit at a card disadvantage. For me, my experience with the card has been that it's just a hard, difficult card to play with. I don't know if you felt the same way, Stan, but I put that card into my deck because I finally started hearing some good arguments for it. I said, okay, I'm going to give this a try. And man, I just found it being incredibly difficult to, get the timing right. I hated agonizing in my draw step every turn, thinking like, okay, do I flash this back? Do I not? Do I just take my draw step? And when you look at the top three cards, knowing how many to bin, counting out how much your treasure cruises are going to cost, counting out what your draw steps are going to look like. It's kind of like the best way I can describe it is I feel like I don't know if you've ever played Guitar Hero, Stan, or CCR, but I've been playing on hard mode for a long time, and then Otherworldly Gaze is like going to expert and adding that last key with your pinky, and it's like suddenly I don't know how to do this. Like suddenly this is way harder now, and so I tend to avoid it. Maybe that's a lazy difficulty answer, but it's kind of where I'm at the moment.
No, I think that's really real. And I think that's also one thing, people love to talk about how difficult their decks are to play. And it's like, that's not a thing to brag about. Like if this deck has a 55% win rate and this deck has a 55% win rate when played optimally, but one is harder to play than the other, you should pick the easier to play deck, right? Like that just will be better for you. And I think that if you look at two lists and one is an Otherworldly Gaze list and one is not an Otherworldly Gaze list, and you think they have similar win rates, or maybe the Gaze deck has a very slightly higher win rate when piloted perfectly, but then you have like an extra micro decision every single turn because you're deciding whether or not to flashback this Otherworldly Gaze, like that's a real argument to just go with the slightly simpler build of the deck. I agree that it is not an easy card to play, and I made mistakes with it this weekend for sure. I have that same argument for it. It just gives you a little higher just density of spells. You dig more for Phoenixes and faster, and you also in the grindy games, it's like an incredible game one card. You board it out in almost every matchup because you don't want it if there's any graveyard hate in your opponent's deck, of course. But, game one against Rakdos, even though they're thought seizing you, maybe because they're thought seizing you, it's quite good. As long as you find some number of Phoenixes in that game one, you can have no cards in your hand, but you have an Otherworldly Gaze in your graveyard, you're probably triple spelling that turn.
Yeah, and as we circle around like this being a difficult card to play, I think one of the things I've found tricky about it is how to sequence it with the other cantrips. Like whether you're using it to set up better draws from consider sleight of hand, or if you're doing it at the end of the chain because you just want to like go through as many cards as possible and then just like dump some cards in your yard in hopes that like that's what gets a Phoenix in there because you don't have another discard outlet in your hand. And I think like figuring out the right position at any given moment is kind of like one of the trickiest things about it. I will say, like, I don't necessarily see it as card disadvantage on the front side because it's still drawing itself. Like, if it's not being picked out of the graveyard, then you have a 2-mana Otherworldly Gaze to cast again or at a future turn, which maybe I'm just kind of like picking at straws here, but it's like there's still more action to be had when you just cast the first Otherworldly Gaze, even if it's the only card in your hand.
No, that's a fair point. And like, especially given the fact that you're a 4 Treasure Cruise deck, it's like, even if you do view it as card disadvantage, you can afford it, right? Like that's kind of the upside of playing 4 Treasure Cruises is you're getting that card advantage elsewhere. You don't need all of your cards to be super great value plays. Like look at Lightning Axe, for example. Like it's 2 for 1 a lot of the time you play it. Unless you're discarding a Phoenix, which you'd like to, but doesn't always come up. You're still happy trading 2 cards for 1 just because you're ripping through your deck so quickly. You're drawing so many cards with Cruise that it doesn't really matter. You're just happy to get the efficient removal spell. Something I do want to mention before we move off of Otherworldly Gaze is that part of my trepidation to playing it was that there are a lot of really excellent Phoenix players in Pioneer that have been playing Phoenix for a long time. Like thinking about like Canister, for example, has been a stalwart for Phoenix. And all of the great Phoenix players, before Sleight of Hand, before Picklock, most of them weren't playing Otherworldly Gaze. They were just playing the other cantrips, and they were playing the the pieces of the puzzle and the time walks, and Otherworldly Gaze was legal, right? And so like my question is what exactly changed about these decks with the addition of Sleight of Hand and Picklock? What about the addition of those cards makes Otherworldly Gaze a better fit for the deck than it used to be? Chris, do you have any insight into why that might be?
Yeah, actually, I do have an answer to that. So I think that, and I think this is also key to figuring out how to build the deck once you put the Otherworldly Gazes in, because Otherworldly Gaze is kind of putting your stake in the ground and saying, like, I want to be just this very efficient, like linear, no nonsense Phoenix deck where I am casting my spells, I am dumping cards into the graveyard, and I am spending all of my mana on spells every single turn and just ripping through my deck as quickly as possible. And I don't think that Otherworldly Gaze can work in a Pieces of the Puzzle deck because of the thing we were talking about earlier. Turn 3 Phoenix is not really a thing in a Pieces of the Puzzle deck. Turn 3 Phoenixes are absolutely a thing in a Picklock Prankster deck. And I think that having that setup card of like Picklock Prankster on turn 2 means that you're just much more efficient at making Phoenixes early and often. And Otherworldly Gaze just like dovetails really nicely with the, I'm going to make Phoenixes as quick as possible, and I'm going to, keep making them over the course of the game, and then hopefully set up some treasure cruises along the way, and kind of where the piece of the puzzle deck is like an 80% treasure cruise deck and a 20% Phoenix deck or something like that, then we kind of like move the needle more and more towards being a Phoenix deck. Now, whether that's actually like good and the thing that you want to be doing is something you have to kind of determine by looking at the format and seeing if it makes sense and that sort of thing. It has felt pretty good to me, but also like I think playing Otherworldly Gaze, probably you don't want Trespass combo in your deck, right? Because it kind of doesn't fit with that plan of dig, cruise, Phoenix. If you get a Trespass stuck in your hand or a Galvanic Iteration in your hand while you're kind of in, I kind of see casting Otherworldly Gaze as kind of going into a card deficit for a little bit and then you make up for it once you hit the cruise. If you're going into a card deficit by casting Otherworldly Gaze and then you also draw a dead card like a Temporal Trespass or a Galvanic Iteration, now you're too many cards down and it becomes much more difficult to recover from that deficit. So I think that you have to, if you want to be casting Otherworldly Gaze, then you want to be focused on that like spin type gameplay, and got to determine if that's what you want to be doing.
Okay, yeah, no, fair enough. And it also makes things nice and easy for sideboarding, right? Because it's the first card you get to cut in almost every matchup.
It's so hard to sideboard with this deck if you don't have Otherworldly Gaze in the main deck, but if you do, that's like 3 slots right there.
For sure.
All right, guys, can I share, like, I don't know, this might be a hot take. Treasure Cruise? Pretty good.
Yeah, it's all right.
We should put it in more decks. Like, you draw 3 cards for 1 mana. That's one of the best cards ever made.
Yeah, that card is incredible, and like Chris rightly identified at the beginning of the cast, like this is first and foremost a Treasure Cruise deck. This is one of the most powerful cards in the format. It does take a lot of work to enable it. Like if you look at the rest of our deck, it's pretty much just all 1 mana spells in order to make that happen. Even cards prioritizing playing cards that mill ourselves, like Picklock, to make it work. But it's all worth it because 1 mana draw 3 is just unbelievable in a format as powered down as Pioneer is. So yeah, definitely the reason to play the deck.
You mentioned it's one of the most powerful cards in the format. Is this like actually the best card in the deck by a significant margin? Like this is the card that makes me feel like in the games where I'm either at parity, it gets me ahead very quickly, or in the games where I'm ahead, it just like shuts the door and kind of keeps your opponent from ever clawing back. And when you're behind, like it can also claw you back too. Like it kind of gets you back in the game because so often when you're behind with Phoenix, with the exception of the Amalia decks that just kind of combo you on the spot, other decks, like when I fall behind, it's because like they've been successful in exchanging resources 1 for 1 over and over and over again, and like eventually get me to the point where I don't have enough cards to like get the Phoenixes out of the yard, and then Treasure Cruise just sort of is like a reset button, and it's like, oh yeah, all of a sudden I'm flush with resources. Sometimes I'm even casting multiple treasure cruises if like my graveyard's big enough and I draw a second one and like boom, I can actually do it twice in a row, and it's like now I'm back in the game and you've just spent all of your time and resources in 8 turns just going 1 for 1 for a while.
Yeah, it definitely completely opens up the game when you just draw that cruise off the top after getting thought seized or disrupted multiple times. And I would say other than Arclight Phoenix, it's probably the only card in the deck that I would say this deck can't exist without it. It's just like the whole deck's built around it. It's the reason to play it. This card were to not be in the format for one reason or another, then I just wouldn't see a reason to fill your deck with all these cantrips and stuff. That's just kind of the reason to be doing Phoenix things at this point.
Yeah, it's the shoulder slump test, right? Like, when does your opponent kind of sink down into their chair? It's when you rip that treasure cruise, or when you get the second Phoenix in the graveyard. Like, those are the two, like, woof, this game's going my way moments. And treasure cruise is the simple one. You just have to have put the cards in your graveyard and then draw the treasure cruise. So
you can shave 1 or 2 post board, like especially if it's game 3 and you've seen like really effective graveyard hate. Maybe it's a rest in peace or whatever else. But like I don't think I ever shave all of them, because even if they're dead in hand, like then you pitch them to Ledger Shredders, you pitch them to axes, what have you. But like it's not uncommon for me to like go to 3 or sometimes go to 2 if I'm really concerned.
Definitely. Yeah, you're correct in that assessment for sure, Stan. Like post board, you pretty much in almost every matchup where you're expecting graveyard hate, which is quite a few, you're just looking to cut down on graveyard centric cards. Cards are going to be weak to the graveyard hate, and that usually means Arclight Phoenixes. That usually means Treasure Cruise. So despite the fact that our deck is built around these cards and they're excellent in the deck, that's where a card like Crackling Drake is really nice to come in. I don't want a bunch of treasure cruises that are relying on the graveyard. I'd rather have, threats and card advantage in the form of Crackling Drake post board. So yeah, always trimming 1, maybe 2 of that card for sure.
Mm-hmm. Last cantrip question. Setting aside Treasure Cruise, between Opt, Consider, and Sleight of Hand, 3 cantrips that are in every version of Phoenix essentially, do you have a hierarchy of best to worst? My feeling is that Consider is the best because it can also put Phoenixes in the yard, but like the delta between Opt and Sleight of Hand is really narrow to me, because like Sleight of Hand letting you choose from 2 cards feels so important, but it's a sorcery, which sometimes kind of sucks. But I don't know, Scott, at the same time you also said this is a deck that wants to play sorcery speed, so how do you guys evaluate the 3, if at all?
I think Chris and I would agree that, and you said there, Stan, that Consider is kind of far and away the best one. Like just the fact that it puts 2 cards in your graveyard, regardless if you're putting a Phoenix in there or not, just to fuel your cruise, it matters a ton. I would play 12 Considers in a heartbeat over any of these other ones. And whenever you do happen to mill a Phoenix, it just feels like such a gimme, such a free roll where you're like, oh my gosh, this is unfair that I'm milling a Phoenix with this one. The things to think about with Sleight of Hand versus Opt. Sleight of Hand is having you look at 2 cards. Opt is only having you look at 1, but you're still seeing 2 cards with the card, right? In a way, you're digging 2 cards deep with both. And so a lot of times the card selection with Opt and Sleight of Hand are functionally the same, because I think to some degree you should know what you're looking for when you cast a Sleight of Hand or an Opt. And so when you do see that card off that scry off an Opt, you'll know, okay, I don't want this one. I'll dig a card deeper for what I want. In terms of considerations for maybe which one you'd want to shave in a given matchup, something to think about is the instant speed on Opt. Plays better with your counter spells, which is nice with Shredder and stuff. It's easy to double spell on their turn. And the main upside of Sleight of Hand is the fact that it doesn't actually draw you a card. So in matchups where cards like Narset or Shieldred are important, sometimes you actually want that Sleight of Hand because it's not triggering that draw a card effect.
Dig it. We can do this so quickly. About 12 removal spells. Fiery Impulse basically always hits for 3, but it only hits creatures, which is fine in a format that cares about the board as much as Pioneer does. Lightning Axe, we've touched on, gets bigger creatures, but still only creatures. It also discards Phoenixes. Have you ever paid 6 for Lightning Axe? I don't think I ever have.
Yeah, it definitely comes up, right, Chris? What do you think?
Every once in a while, as I was running through Mark Stanton's games in the top 8 from the RC with him, there was one spot where it was like, oh, I really he didn't spot it at the time, but as we were reviewing, he was like, I think I should have just paid for 6 for Lightning Axe here. And I was like, yeah, that actually sounds really good to me. I didn't spot it either until he pointed out this was that was where you. So it is one thing where probably more 6 mana Lightning Axes should be cast, but you don't always even see it because you're not thinking about that as an option.
It can be kind of hard to identify when you want to do that, right? Because getting 6 lands into play isn't always something that happens easily, and usually if that's happening, it's with intention. It's like I'm playing these lands because I need to get to Hall the Storm Giants or to cast it. But a lot of times I'll see spots, like you mentioned, Chris, where people will just pay 1 for the axe, discard a land. It's like, well, hold on, why don't you just play that land, work towards hard casting it, and it works out better in the long run. So it doesn't come up often, but it's a really nice alternate mode to have, for sure. Definitely happy it's there when it comes up.
I do want to talk about the removal suite in general just a little bit, and this is where my stance, like Phoenix is a control deck, comes from. When the Pioneer Phoenix deck was first kind of getting iterated on, there was a tendency to try to imitate modern Phoenix and play like analogs of the cards as much as possible. Obviously, there's no analog to like Manamorphose, but they would play like a lot of Izzet Charms because it's the most like Faithless Looting, and they would play in the removal slot like Wild Slashes or whatever shock that can go to the face. And then over time, those just kind of got pushed out of the deck because they didn't kill enough stuff. They didn't kill at a high enough like mana ratio. Wild Slash rarely kills a 3 mana creature, right? Fiery Impulse kills almost every 3 mana creature, save like the Preacher of the Schism that people put specifically in their deck because it doesn't die to Fiery Impulse. And getting that, I have killed your 3 mana creature with my 1 mana spell allows you to also cast a bunch of cantrips and use your mana on that. And so it's not a priority to play spells that can necessarily be cast at any time just to get Phoenixes back, because like, oh yeah, I gotta go to the face. That was fine when your spell was Lightning Bolt, because man, 3 damage to the face is a lot of damage to the face. With a shock, less exciting, and the ability to kill stuff like Graveyard Trespasser just way more important, and kind of cemented the placement of Phoenix as like, yeah, this is a control deck. We kill creatures and then we kill our opponent over time.
For sure. And and Lightning Axe is really important for a lot of reasons, like we've been talking about so far. But you mentioned that Lightning Axe kills big creatures. It sounds obvious, but there's not a whole lot of ways to do that in blue-red. I'm a big Steam Vents gamer. I love playing these blue-red decks. And if your deck can't enable Lightning Axe, there's really no other good options for cheap ways to kill big creatures in these colors. And so you're like actively thrilled to be allowed to put this card into the deck because it tackles problems that no other card can in such an efficient way. Yeah,
the fact that you can kill Shieldred for 1 mana is... there's many turns where I'm sitting there like praying for my opponent's play to be Shieldred go, because you know that you win the game at that point. What you're really hoping that they don't do is cast Archfiend of the Dross in that spot, because you can't. That one's a lot harder to kill, and that's actually like a very specific leak of the Phoenix deck. Just an exploitable weakness is once you hit those 6 toughness threats, and so I know that like the System Magic Rakdos list is really leaning into just playing 3 Croxas. The front side of Croxa, not good against Phoenix. Once it's in the graveyard, though, the whole game revolves around trying not to get Croxed. And Archfiend of the Dross is like a pretty similar thing, where that thing's in play, it's extremely difficult to kill, and also every time one of your Phoenixes dies, you take damage, and you got to figure out a way around that, and it's not easy.
The last 2 removal spells that come up are Spikefield Hazard, which serves double duty as like a possible land, get out of jail free card if you open a land light hand. Deals 1, it can exile a thing if it's, I guess, the last point of damage that kills the creature. It can also deal a point of damage to your face, like if you need a 3rd spell to trigger Phoenixes in a way on an empty board, like Fiery Impulse becomes an issue there. But Hazard will ping for 1, of course. And then we have Torch the Tower, which is another newer one. This is a single red instant. It has Bargain. It's not a shock. It deals 2 damage to target creature or walker, but if it was Bargain, it deals 3 damage to that permanent, and you scry 1. correct me if I'm wrong, there's no way to bargain this in the deck. Nope. Because to bargain, you need to sack an artifact, enchantment, or token. So this is just a 1 mana, like, effectively it's magma spray against Phoenixes or certain creatures in Amalia.
Yeah, this one's going up in stock, I think, as of late, just because it's, really nice to be able to have a way to exile Phoenixes in the mirror. It's also something that's a pretty unique tool against Amalia. Being able to exile the Amalia is definitely a big game. You kind of need to cut some number of fire impulses for it, though, and so that's what makes it a difficult exchange to make. It's hard to make that swap because you're basically trading an extra point for the exile effect. That's the main trade-off you're making. In some metagames that's worth it, but I think in most metagames it's not. But it's definitely a nice option to have to reach for in case the metagame does get to that point where you'd want that effect.
Yeah, in really focused metas, I think, if you were playing in an 8 or 16 player invitational and you started making good predictions that Phoenix and Amalia are heavy portions of the field, then it becomes like, yeah. But outside of that, like, Fire Impulse killing Smuggler's Copter and Graveyard Trespasser in particular is just huge, and I really struggle to give that up.
Mm-hmm. And then we have some additional flex slots. This is where I put Galvanic Iteration, which is the thing that copies your next spell. Temporal Trespass, which is the Delve card that lets you take an extra turn. You always see those cards together, right? You're never playing Iteration without Trespass or vice versa. That's a nice wombo combo. Like, Scott, I think you kind of mentioned this briefly, but that's where this deck almost feels like a combo deck, because once you do Galvanic Temporal Trespass, you usually win the game on that follow-up turn. But sometimes I see decks without it. Like, why are people cutting this 2-card package?
So I'll talk a little bit about the upsides, and maybe I'll pass it over to Chris to talk about the definitely very real downsides of it. The Galvanic Iteration Trespass combo was something that the Pieces of the Puzzle versions of this deck leaned on pretty heavily in the past. Ever since you've got Picklock Prankster in the mix and you don't have as many 2-for-1s in the deck, you kind of need more Treasure Cruises to make up for that. And so most lists you'll see either run 0 or just 1 of each, like I've been doing. And I really love the aspect of the deck because it gives you kind of a whole nother angle of attack game 1, where decks that are going over the top of you, like ramp decks or control decks or big 5-color mid-range decks, sometimes a couple hasty 3/2s and your shredders aren't really enough to get you over the finish line if they have a bunch of removal spells or what have you. And just having one of each of those combos anywhere in your deck, because you're so good at ripping through your deck in the long game against the decks that are going over the top of you, you should be able to find it, and it gives you a way to actually slam the door shut. A common play pattern you'll see with Galvanic and Trespass is just doing the combo you can do it for as little as 5 mana, and then just killing them with Hall of Storm Giants. It's just a really easy way to kill the decks that, thinking of like the 5-color mid-range decks that do like Leyline Binding, Chain of the Rocks. It can be kind of hard to get over the finish line against those decks, but if you have that just one of each of those combos anywhere in your deck, you feel so much better in game 1. It's a very heavily reliant graveyard thing, so just like Otherworldly Gaze, it does come out a lot in the post-board games, but I've really enjoyed it as a tool game 1. But there's some very real downsides to it for sure.
Yeah, and I go back and forth on whether or not I want to play it. I don't think it's like clear that you should. I mean, most people do still, and I think it's probably the right way to build the deck. And I do think that probably means that you don't play Otherworldly Gaze, as I talked about earlier, because they don't really coincide. They're slightly different game plans that don't go together super well. But yeah, I think combo is very important to have in your deck in like the mirrors, and yeah, any time where their removal game 1 lines up very well against your stuff, your Phoenixes and your Ledger Shredders, then combo can be a way to steal games. Where it comes up as like, oh, I wish I didn't have this in my deck, is the grindier the matchup is in ways where they're directly able to trade for your resources. Like the Phoenix Mirror is grindy, but they can't trade for your cards in hand or your cards in graveyard or like permanently deal with your Phoenixes. So it's different from grinding the way that you do against Rakdos, where they're thought seizing you and trying to maybe land a Graveyard Trespasser and just rob you of your resources. And then you peel a temporal trespass off the top, and it's just a blank card. And also when you're on the back foot, you know, a treasure cruise you could cast and then draw a removal spell or two off of it, the land you need. And not that you're cutting treasure cruises, you know, and anybody who's playing a trespass, it's the 5th delve spell. But just as a comparison, you're getting attacked by Convoke and you draw a treasure cruise, you cast that for 1 mana, it draws you a land and a removal spell, you keep going. You draw a temporal trespass and you're like, I can't cast this right now. Or, you know, maybe you pay 3 mana for it, exile your graveyard, and now your graveyard's empty for your treasure cruise that you need because it's eating the same resources as your treasure cruise. You can't just kind of cycle it the way an actual time warp would be cycled. So decks that are exchanging resources with you, decks that are heavily pressuring you, you know, drawing one part of the combo can be a blank piece of cardboard for a decent portion of the game. So that's the risk of it. The payoff, though, can be very high, and I have found myself in, you know, game 1s against Amalia missing being able to top deck a temporal trespass, because one of the ways that those games end, it's like very difficult to start attacking them. You get a couple of Phoenixes in play, maybe you can attack with 1 Phoenix, but you have to leave 1 back to hold off 2 or 3 1/1s, and so you're not clocking them that fast. But then you draw the temporal trespass and you go, oh, okay, well, I can attack with 2 Phoenixes on the turn I cast the trespass, and then I can attack with 2 Phoenixes and, you know, this Ledger Shredder on the last, and that will kill them now, or something like that. And that turnaround can be pretty powerful. So there's a reason that the combo is in the vast majority of the Phoenix decks that you see. And although I haven't been playing it, I recognize the power of it and go back and forth on whether or not I should be playing it.
How often are you copying anything else with Galvanic Iteration?
It depends on how desperate the situation is.
Right. That's mostly just kind of gravy with the card, right? Because it's in the deck as a combo piece, really. And in general, in Magic, when you draw a combo piece without the other half, it's kind of a dead card. One of the nice things about this is it's totally not. You know, you can mill it and it gets some value. You can discard it; it'll be there as value. And your deck's full of cheap spells, so copying a Lightning Axe in a key spot is huge. A lot of the things that people reach for against Phoenix with 6 toughness, like Chris was mentioning earlier, it's really nice to have that card in your deck just as an extra red spell, really, as like it plays as an extra Fire Impulse, it plays as an extra Axe, just to finish off those things that people reach for against Phoenix that are a bit too big. So, I mean, honestly, the answer is quite a bit. If you happen to draw it and, you know, you need an extra removal spell, I'm definitely going for it, and it ends up being really nice.
And if you're using the front side to do that, then the back side is still in your graveyard to combo at some point late in the game.
Right.
The deck will run frequently some number of Izzet Charms. Usually it's just like 1 or 2 that they do a couple things okay. It's never amazing, but like every once in a while you'll have 2 Phoenixes in your hand and it is a charm and you're like, we did it. Achievement unlocked. Spell Pierce and Joario Disruption. I think these cards are pretty self-explanatory. I do find that I like to side out the Disruption if I'm on the draw. Does that smell right to you guys?
It's maybe it could be a little bit harder to work on the draw. I've found that like I don't board it out often because I'm just counting it as a land most of the time. And if it's in my deck, it's in the deck, and it's structurally a land in the deck. So, and if you do get to counter something with it, that's awesome. But most of the time, it's just a land. So I try my best to not board it out. Usually, it's something that's greedy that I'm reaching for. But generally, if I'm disciplined, then I'm keeping it in the deck.
And then the last one I want to bring up is an addition I actually saw from MTGO user Super Jerk was the first person I saw do this. Chris, maybe you can offer some insights on what that jerk was up to. Prismari Command?
Yeah, I can probably offer some insights. For anyone not in on the joke, that is my MTGO username. Prismari Command.
What? I thought I was just making fun of an MTGO user.
So Prismari Command is a main deckable one of your shatters, and you generally want a certain number of shatters in your sideboard because of Unlicensed Terse and Reckoner Bankbuster. Smuggler's Copter less so, because that they have to stand that up for it to do anything, and you can always Fiery Impulse it. But those are kind of the big ones that you kind of want to kill at some point in the game, and so you generally need 3-ish answers to them in your sideboard to feel comfortable. Prismari Command is one that you can main deck that also serves the role of it can be an Izzet Charm as long as it's not the last spell that you cast for pitching Phoenixes, because it refunds the mana with the treasure. It also kind of gives a lot of output for one piece of cardboard against decks like Rakdos in particular. Like game 1, you get Thoughtseize, you're left with like some cards that don't really do anything, maybe too many lands. You rip the Prismari Command, and now you can pitch some lands, maybe kill their Reckoner Bankbuster or kill their Blood Tithe Harvester that's pressuring you, and just kind of like keep going, and it like digs you closer to your treasure cruise or whatever. I've been happy with it. It's not a must.
Yeah, definitely not a must. Something I want to touch on with Izzet Charm as well as Prismari Command. For a long time, I was just playing the 2 Spell Pierces in the main, not touching on either one of those. But I ran into a lot of spots game 1 where there are matchups in the format where your Shredders die a lot. They never live. You know, they have a million removal spells or what have you, and they don't have a lot of good targets for Lightning Axe. And so it's really nice to have at least one card in your deck, whether it be Izzet Charm or Prismari Command, that you can be digging for with your cruises and digging for with your Picklock Pranksters, that actually can unclog your hand of Phoenixes. You know, you find in a lot of spots against those decks, it's like I have 2 Phoenixes in my hand, but they haven't given me anything to axe. They kill all my Shredders before I can, you know, get much value off of them. And you just need to get those Phoenixes out of your hand. And Prismari Command and Izzet Charm are both like flexible options as just a one of in your deck to dig for when you do find yourself in those spots. So I've really liked one of either of those cards in the main deck.
I did find myself in that spot against the last round of day 1 of the RC against Rakdos Sacrifice. This is a matchup where you tend to take out all of your Ledger Shredders post board because they're not good, basically. There's a lot more that goes into that. But so you are lower on discard outlets, but you play these longer games, so it's not always that costly. But I was in this spot where I was getting worked by an unlicensed hearse, and I had 2 Phoenixes in my hand at the time. My opponent thought seizes me and sees Picklock Prankster, a Consider, 2 Phoenixes, and a Crackling Drake, and goes, well, I mean, that Crackling Drake has 15 power, so I guess I'd better take it. So he takes the Crackling Drake, and I'm just looking at this hearse that's beating me, and I'm like, I guess I just hope that it would be really nice if this Picklock Prankster could hit my one of Prismari Command. And so I got 6 lands, I cast Free the Fae, I hit Prismari Command. It's just, you know, that's the one we wanted here. We kill the unlicensed hearse, discard the 2 Phoenixes. You know, unlicensed hearse can't respond to the Phoenix discard. It's just dead. And then we cast the Consider. That's 3 spells. We put 2 Phoenixes into play. There's no unlicensed hearse on the table anymore. And then we're kind of golden from there.
That's the dream.
That's
the dream right there.
That's what you put it in your deck hoping will happen. And it's not every day.
If you were looking for a hard sell for Prismari Command, I think that's it right there. I mean, that's the situation. Just nothing else is doing that.
But the reason that these slots are like flex slots and one-ofs is none of them are clearly like, you gotta have this one in your deck. And so you just kind of pick a couple of the effects that you want. And because you see 30 plus cards in a game, you're very likely to find your like one of this effect that you don't really need twice in a game. And so these one ofs can have an outsized impact.
Love it. Okay. So we promised to talk about Amalia combo and just like matchups in general. Let's do that now before we get sleepy. Amalia combo, breakout deck of RC Atlanta. I've been playing against it and I'm shocked because you think your control deck would be very good against this creature combo deck, but then they play, Return to the Ranks and just laugh in your face after you spent all these cards. They gain 40 life, it feels like, assuming they don't force a draw. They just undo any damage you've ever done with your Phoenixes, undo any removal spells you ever cast on their creatures, and then just win on the spot. And I think the data showed after the weekend that the way people were building Phoenixes versus the way people were building Amalia is pretty significantly favored. Is there a way to shore that up?
I got trapped by this because the versions that popped up initially on Magic Online of Amalia were not built the best, not piloted the cleanest, and their sideboards they were basically playing 0-card sideboards. They were like bringing in Leyline of the Void, which I think just actively makes the deck worse against Phoenix to draw a Leyline of the Void, because they just want to be slamming, combo threat after combo threat every single turn and making you have it. And it's very difficult to have it every single turn. I think that playing the sweepers is really good because you can kind of start shutting them down and making them less likely to be able to threaten the combo. You have to bring in some amount of counter magic because you have to stop Return to the Ranks from happening. It's a tough matchup because of just like how relentless they are in continuing to making threats. And I think the biggest key is mulliganing aggressively. If your hand has no red cards in it, you can't keep a hand that's like 2 lands, 4 cantrips and a Picklock Prankster or something like that. You have to be reacting to their stuff as early as possible.
So, and that includes like the 1-drops, the innkeepers, everything.
Well, you're hoping to catch those with the sweeper because targeting all of their Soul Wardens with your removal is a great way to just run out of removal.
Yeah. No, okay, so when we talk about sweepers though, like most Phoenix players these days are playing Brotherhood's End. Are we supposed to move back to Anger of the Gods and just like hope you don't kill your own Phoenixes with it?
I mean, maybe, honestly, is the answer. I had a really similar experience to Chris in that, I wasn't scared of this Amalia deck at all the first couple weeks he was being played. And even like the weekend before Atlanta, lists were popping up, but I was still beating it relatively frequently just because people picking it up had just picked it up, or like Chris mentioned, the sideboards weren't built perfectly. The lists that showed up in the RC and the way that they were piloted, I think that we're pretty squarely disadvantaged in the matchup, and it might take stretch cards like Anger of the Gods that you wouldn't otherwise want to play to balance that matchup out, because I definitely struggled there and found that it was much harder than I was initially giving it credit for.
I saw somebody putting Grafdigger's Cages in their Phoenix deck because their plan was take out all the Phoenixes against Amalia anyways, so might as well cage them.
One card I do want to highlight there that I don't have a ton of reps with just yet, but something that I did see in some Phoenix sideboards at the RC that might be a good strategy versus Amalia was Ashiok Dream Render, I believe is the name. That one seemed okay. It's like a 3-mana hybrid blue-black planeswalker that you can mill target player for 4 and then exile target opponent's graveyard, which is like nice to help with your Return to the Rank stuff, but it also has a static ability of not letting your opponents search their library, so it can shut off the Corda Calling as well, so serves a little bit of a dual function. I'm not super sold on that yet. I'll have to try it, but that was just one that piqued my interest that I saw popping up at the RC.
It was also one, I think the intent of that card was also to be a split hate card, like for the mirror as well. Because if you keep denying your opponent your graveyard while milling yourself, you're certainly going to be the better Treasure Cruise deck. I'm a little skeptical about the 3-mana blue sorcery speed planeswalker being a mirror breaker. It depends a little on your opponent's sideboard, but you run right into the counter magic that gets brought in, Mystical Dispute especially.
Yeah.
And, I had an opponent bring in Narsets against me, which should be a scary thing. But I saw them in his sideboard, so I brought in my 2 Brazen Borrowers, and basically, when he cast the Narset, it ultimately like put him into a tempo black hole that he couldn't crawl out of because I was just trading for his turns very efficiently.
Right.
I think the other arguable breakout deck of the weekend was Blue-White Control, which I think there was some expectation that Control stock was going to decline in a post-Appraiser world, but between Amalia combo and just like the rest of the field, but for Phoenix, maybe, Control was just sort of feasting. Have you found that, like, generally speaking, like Phoenix is somewhat favored there? I feel like as long as they're not exiling your birds, or even if they are, like, you can then like just kill them with lands, but you're threat heavy enough that you can basically like play at least a creature every turn and then force them to like spend their turns like constantly looking for answers. And then sometimes you can recur the Phoenixes. Sometimes you just play Hall of the Storm Giants and activate it.
Yeah.
What's your assessment of that matchup?
Yeah, I found the matchup to be really good for Phoenix, and I think that the data will back me up on that one, at least at the at the RC. I think Phoenix was the one matchup that Blue White was struggling with the most. I think that's just a function of your spells being so much cheaper. They just have so many expensive cards in their deck, and if you're ever able to trade 1 mana for 4 mana or 1 mana for 3 mana, like you're often able to do against them, you just feel like you're really far ahead. So game 1, unless they get an early farewell off, or a lot of the lists of the RC were even reaching for main deck Hollowed Moonlight, which is definitely
that
good
one's
against
scary
Phoenix as well.
Yeah,
definitely that can swing a matchup for sure. I played against a lot of lists that had 2 of those in their main deck, and it's like, it's pretty good. It's a pretty good one against Phoenix. But generally, I've found that game 1's great because you can protect your Phoenixes from all the exile effects they have with your own Fiery Impulses that would be dead otherwise. Things get a little trickier games 2 and 3, but because they have so much more graveyard hate, things get a little hairier. But I found that matchup to be really good. If I'm sitting across from Blue White as a Phoenix player, I got a smile on my face for sure.
And the thing about the post-board games, which I think you realize just after playing a lot of them, is that they're not a very good control deck once Rest in Peace is in play. So your counter magic is better against them than their counter magic is against you generally, because their spells that count all cost 4 or 5 mana. And you don't want to just run stuff into Dovin's vetoes and just like be getting blown out all game. But if you play carefully and just watch for the turns that, oh yeah, Wandering Emperor would be good this turn, I better make sure to have a counter spell ready for it, then that's really good. And then their main card advantage engine is Memory Deluge. And in game, in a lot of situations, I am interested in countering the first half of a Memory Deluge, because the first half of a Memory Deluge sets up the flashback of the Memory Deluge very well and kind of like gets their whole engine rolling. If they have a Rest in Peace in play, though, their Memory Deluges almost don't matter. They're not able to cast that like giant flashback card advantage spell anymore, and you just keep up with them on cards, and you trade 1-for-1 with them a bunch, and you can't Treasure Cruise, but you can force a Crackling Drake through, and so you have similar ways of getting card advantage in your deck, and you just don't have to be afraid of like the Memory Deluge train rolling out of the station. And the post-board games can play out pretty interestingly with no graveyards available to either player.
Why is Lotus Field so hard? Is Lotus Field just good against Steam Vents? Is that what it comes down to?
We're an anti-creature deck, and they are a stack-based deck that counter spells aren't very good against.
Yeah. It's weird because it seems like if you're unfamiliar with the format, that maybe you'd have an okay matchup here. It's like, I'm a blue deck, I can put pressure into play, and I have counters to back it up. That would seem like it would be enough, but the whole Lotus Field deck is just set up to win those fights on the stack. I can just make so much mana. Your soft counters like Spell Pierce and Izzet Charm just aren't enough. And you are pretty good at putting on pressure, but it's not nearly enough to actually close the game out in a meaningful time frame. It doesn't really matter if you hit them for 3 or 6 here and there. Like, they're just going to win the game on turn 5, like almost no matter what. So the strategy for me has just been to A, hope to dodge it, B, just mulligan aggressively for a shredder or something, and hope they stumble. And that's kind of it. It sounds defeatist, but I think that you have to be realistic about where your good matchups are and where your bad matchups are, and that's very firmly in the bad matchup category.
And it sounds like it's so bad that it's not even worth like putting an Alpine Moon or 2 in your sideboard, because like you just get so little benefit out of that.
Yeah, I'm not convinced there's any number of Alpine Moons you could put in your sideboard that would make the matchup favorable. So
there's probably some number, but
I think so.
But once
4,
you can't spend those slots on it when the deck is 3 or 4% of the meta game at most. Right. Once if that deck hits like 8%, then you could, but you also maybe should just play something else then.
Right.
The other deck I think is important to mention is Rakdos Mid, which has been like a pillar of the format for at least a year, and we're good here. Like Chris, you mentioned like sometimes you just want them to tap out for Shieldred because you sort of feel like you're guaranteed to win from those positions, and I just found like, because we're so recursive, and because like we're recursive and we have removal spells that line up against pretty much all of their creatures unless they're pre-boarding for us, like there's so little that they can do to like really impact us in the long term. And cards like Thoughtseize and Trespasser and like even Liliana, if they're playing that still, like, just don't really impact us in meaningful ways whatsoever.
Well, Trespasser is one that does. Trespasser, depending on how the game is playing out, can be a problem. But yeah, I love my Rakdos matchup now, which is odd to say because it previously was not a good matchup. But something about the efficiency of Picklock Pranksters plus the dig from having your sleight of hands as cantrips 9 through 12, they Thoughtseize you, but you are going to Treasure Cruise. Previously, it was they Thoughtseize you, and maybe you wouldn't hit a Treasure Cruise, and then that's good. But anytime you have been Thoughtseized and then you Treasure Cruise, that's not good for the Thoughtseize player. And the vast majority of games now, you will Treasure Cruise after getting Thoughtseized unless they really hit you with something. And so I think the matchup is just fine now until they start doing different things like I got to play a bunch of Archfiend of the Dross or Croxas or whatever specifically for the matchup.
Yeah, there's definitely a 75 that you could build of a Rakdos deck that would be favored against Phoenix. That could totally exist, but it wouldn't be a realistic deck against the rest of the format. So, Chris mentioned Graveyard Trespasser. As good as it is against Phoenix, you're seeing that one get cut or shaved a lot now, just as these Rakdos decks are trying to lower their curve, play Copters, play Enties. This all favors us as a Phoenix player. They're just playing a lot of really easy creatures to kill that don't interact with our graveyard in a meaningful way. I think
and Copter over Bankbuster is
right.
Just a huge net positive for Phoenix.
100%. That was definitely one of the ways you could lose a game one, is they Thoughtseize your only proactive card advantage spell, or the way to dig through your deck, and they play a Bankbuster, and you're just sitting there with Fire Impulses and Axes, and they can definitely get ahead that way for sure. Yeah, I think just having the extra cantrip just gave you the redundancy to beat up on all the Thoughtseize decks now. Like you can get Thoughtseized and you'll just be able to find whatever it is you're looking for down the line. You're so redundant in that way. So I've really enjoyed the matchup. In addition to it being a favorable matchup, I think it's just fun too. It's very interactive. It's very swingy back and forth. And I've really enjoyed that one.
It's my favorite Magic to play in Pioneer. Every time I see Blackleaf Cliffs, I kind of pump the fist, both because I do feel like we're fine against them, but also because I know like we're going to have a good time playing Magic.
We're going to have a game of Magic.
Yeah. And this is, entirely, this is anecdotal, but in the RC, I played against Rakdos Midrange 4 times on day one. I went 3-1 against it. The one match that I lost, my opponent was playing 4 Graveyard Trespassers, and the 3 matches that I won, they were not playing. Nobody else was playing more than 2 Graveyard Trespassers. So,
good news for Phoenix.
I feel like with Trespasser though, like you just have to prepare for it and like don't let them catch you with your birds down. Like you can almost use the ward effect to your benefit while also like removing it fairly easily. That's why like
it's mostly that Trespassers in multiples are a problem. The first one you usually can deal with at a slight card advantage deficit and then make it up, but then you generally have your pants down for the second one if they happen to have it.
Right. Okay, so you know what else is a Thoughtseize deck other than Rakdos? It's Grixis Phoenix. Is it worth playing Grixis Phoenix anymore? It had its day in the sun, and then it feels like the sun is setting on Thoughtseize and what is it? Deadly? No, it's not Deadly Dispute. It's
Bitter Triumph.
That's the one. Bitter Triumph.
Yeah. So I think that honestly is the biggest reason to be Izzet. As I said earlier, the efficiency of Lightning Axe, which often is the single best removal spell in the format. 1 mana, 5 damage, plus an effect that you want. It's a remarkable difference costing 1 mana. I mean, 2 mana is twice as much as 1 mana. And if you're looking at Phoenix as an anti-creature deck, the gap between I have 8 1-mana terminates and I have 4 1-mana terminates, and actually Fatal Push is significantly worse than Fiery Impulse. It's also significantly worse. You can't trigger Revolt in the Dimir version of the deck. So Fatal Push is extremely limited in what it can target, and then Bitter Triumph costs 2 mana. And so you're just a lot less efficient at dealing with your opponent's creature threats with the Dimir version. And Thoughtseize, an incredible card, the entire reason to play the deck, that costs you 2 life. So with the 6 shock lands and the 4 Thoughtseizes in the deck, you end up paying quite a bit of life, with the Dimir version. And so against the onboard decks, you end up on the back foot more often. You end up with a lower life total than you are really comfortable being at. And that's the cost of playing that version, is you're just a little less efficient and you are not as good against creatures for multiple reasons. And you kind of get pushed around by stuff like, I found Convoke much more difficult as the blue-black version. And decks like that, I found Humans much more difficult as well. And those are matchups that you should be kind of pretty happy to play against with the Izzet version. And now you are much more capable of beating Lotus Field, but that's only a small portion of the format. And we're specifically choosing Izzet Phoenix because we just kind of plan not to play against that type of deck.
But Gris, have you considered that Grixis is sweet and cool?
It is sweet and cool. And you know what? I top aided a challenge. We top aided the same challenge playing Dimir Phoenix, and I haven't top aided a challenge playing Izzet Phoenix yet. So
I mean, yeah, at least we gave it a try, right? We're not just dismissive of it at first. You know, I will admit that when I first saw it, I think it did well at one of the RCs. I believe it was a South American one. I just thought, like, okay, I mean, that seems cute, that seems sweet, but it doesn't seem like it's got, you know, it has legs in the format. But I'll admit, once I tried it, I was like, this works pretty well. And the Thoughtseize is really nice to have in a Phoenix deck. But I think Chris was touching on this. Maybe this is an oversimplification, but I think one of my friends described it to me this way after trying it, and it made a lot of sense to me. It felt like the Grixis deck was it was a worse Phoenix deck. It was worse at doing the Phoenix things and returning them reliably. It was also a worse Thoughtseize deck than like Rakdos was, because you don't have as many standalone standalone threats like Fable or you know, other high impact 3-drops. So you don't have as many ways to actually punish them for taking their important removal spells, slamming a Fable. So like, you're a worse Rakdos midrange deck and you were a worse Phoenix deck. So like, what do we really do in here? There are all sorts of problems with the Grixis version that, you know, maybe we don't have time to get into all of them right now, but just to touch on a couple of them, like Chris mentioned, with Izzet, the curve's lower, so you can more reliably get your Phoenixes back with Axe. Chris also mentioned that Dimir deals a lot of damage to itself, so it's not very good at racing, which is kind of Phoenix's bread and butter. The Izzet deck also fights the Graveyard Hate better as well. Not only because you actually have answers to Graveyard Hate, like Unlicensed Hearse, you actually have ways to kill that, whereas the blue-black version is just kind of cold to it. But even if you can't kill their Graveyard Hate piece, Black doesn't have as many good threats post-board that don't involve the graveyard. Crackling Drake is a really big deal for what I mentioned earlier, that it kills them, and it also is a value play. Black has Shouldered, which is great. That's not really going to help you against something like Black-Red that's attacking your graveyard and also has plenty of removal spells to kill your guys. So not having that value threat in the sideboard was kind of a problem. And then last but not least, you're mostly a blue-black deck. You can't really cast your Snare Thought through that easily. And that seems pretty obvious, but that comes up, and it feels pretty bad when you can't just cast the card in your hand, you know?
Yeah, especially like, as you were saying, like the gap between the two juke threats of like Shieldred and Crackling Drake. So say you're playing against Rakdos, you're both low on resources, and you've reached the 4-mana threats point in the game. You play a Crackling Drake, and if their response is to play their own threat, like, I'm going to play my own Shieldred here, that's fine. You win by attacking with Crackling Drake. You play a Shieldred, they play a Shieldred. Now you're playing a game that you don't want to play, where you each have a Shieldred in play, and your 4-mana threat is never going to close out the game, and your graveyard is getting attacked, so you don't have a way out of that situation.
Cool. So, sorry, Grixis. You just have to wait for Lotus Field to get better, I guess? Or we need more stronger tools in the blue-black shell to actually make it worth it.
I do agree that the deck is better than my intuition told me that it would be. And Sedgemoor Witch is also like a really... I really like Sedgemoor Witch a lot. So
that's funny.
The life gain off of the pests can help you in those tougher... When they're attacking you with creatures, Sedgemoor Witch is a great, like, go-to card from your sideboard for that. So there's ways to mitigate some of this stuff, but I think ultimately on balance, like, Izzet just is solving problems more efficiently.
Right.
Okay. There's one last thing I want to talk about before we wrap this up, which is a certain card that's buried in the sideboard that's really fun, cool, and cute, and doesn't come up in Phoenix conversations that I hear. Okay? And that's called Fable the Mirror Breaker. I love bringing in this card, and I love bringing it in when I've also brought in Crackling Drake. I have won a couple games of like living the dream and making Crackling Drake copies and drawing extra cards and just like swinging for 10, like the turn that I literally cast the Crackling Drake. How do you think about Fable in different matchups? Do you find that there's a place where it's like at its best, at its worst? Are you always thinking, or are you ever thinking about the Fable Drake Wombo combo? What's your assessment there?
I'll start on this one, then I'll pass it over to Chris, because Chris is the one that actually put me on to Fable in the sideboard as of late, and then he's since taken it out, so I'd like to hear his reasoning for that in just a moment. But I think there's a lot of upside to Fable. I mean, not exactly a hot take that Fable is just a great card. I think that along with Chris's convincing and just some thinking about how I wanted to build the sideboard, Fable made a lot of sense to me. It checks the boxes of the post-board threat in that it's also kind of a value play. So when they are bringing Graveyard Hate, it doesn't feel bad to just play it and have them kill it with a removal spell because you get all this extra value in addition. The card it's historically replaced in the sideboard was Saheeli. That's one that I was unimpressed by for a long time. People like it as kind of a juke threat out of the sideboard, but I was noticing that against the Thoughtseize decks, that's not really what you want to do. They are really trying to play a low resource game with you with a bunch of discard spells, go blanks, Thoughtseizes, duresses. And when all you have is Saheeli, let's say you top deck it after they strip your hand, it's literally doing nothing. And that's not at all what you want out of a sideboard threat. So I think it's a pretty easy argument to make to say that the Fable is better against the Thoughtseize decks than Saheeli is. For a while, I could hear the case that Saheeli was better against the blue-white decks because they have a hard time with Planeswalkers, but since Get Lost got printed, I don't even think that's true anymore. So I don't really see a good reason to play Saheeli. Maybe you don't need that slot at all, like Chris is going to talk about, but in terms of Saheeli versus Fable, I think it's pretty clear that Fable is the answer in those low-resource games.
Yeah, I originally had the identical feelings about Saheeli. I've never been impressed by it, and it seemed to just kind of get worse and worse, despite you having a higher density of cantrips now, which like would kind of make it better. Yeah, it just doesn't do the thing that you're hoping it would do. I initially was excited about Fable because, and this is not true. This is still absolutely true. I like bringing it in because you get to keep all of your treasure cruises in and still have ways of pitching them when that Graveyard Hate is hitting you, and you can just pitch your extra treasure cruises to Fable when the rest in peace is in play. And that's a really valuable thing in a juke threat, to be able to make the rest of your deck better against the hate cards that your opponent is bringing in, and not just being good on its own against the hate cards the way that Crackling Drake is. I really mostly just cut it because I was playing against so much Rakdos, and I would rather draw Crackling Drake into Crackling Drake over anything else in the Rakdos matchup. And that was just kind of ultimately the thing that made me go towards just Crackling Drakes. It's also like, you can't really halfway it. You can't bring in the Fables if you're not. You can bring in the Fables if you're not bringing in the Crackling Drakes, but it's not very good and it's not as threatening. So you kind of need to bring them all in as a package.
Yeah, I've never done that. It's never come up to where that's been the correct case, I think, to only bring in one. So you're right, it is kind of a package deal.
Which is fine. It's a good package. And there's matchups that are not Rakdos where drawing 2 Crackling Drakes is really clunky, but drawing a Fable and a Crackling Drake is excellent. So I don't have any reason to say like you must play the 3 Crackling Drakes and 2 Brazen Borrowers that I registered for the RC. But I think it was mostly just that I hit a place where I wanted 2 Brazen Borrowers in my sideboard. And then it felt very weird to register like 2 Crackling Drakes and 1 Fable of the Mirror Breaker. And I do really like bringing in 3 Crackling Drakes versus Rakdos. So that's just kind of how I ended up on that particular package of sideboard threats.
Cool. Well, we did it, boys. We dove into a deck. You know, we touched on at the top of the show when we were introducing Scott that you're the current Pioneer Trophy leader. What's that feel like? Like, are you getting recognized a lot?
Everyone's just bowing down around me. It feels
At the mall, people like give you like
God,
free pretzels and stuff.
Yeah, no, I mean, I do. If what you're asking is yes, I do feel a lot better than everyone else. So that's really nice to have. Just give me that confidence. No, it's a funny thing because Magic Online doesn't reward that at all. So it's literally just clout, and that's
Don't
it.
you get like better avatars or something? Like,
do you? I don't even think that's true. Yeah.
Nope, I don't think so.
You get like a certain avatar when you get enough trophies more than anything.
Right. It is funny though. But since I've been in the league, whenever I do, I'll often get paired against someone online, and they'll immediately type in the chat like, "Great, so unlucky. Like I'm playing against the trophy." Like they just think I'm like this unbeatable, and it's like, dude, no. Like you're probably gonna beat me. It's fine. Someone did mention at the RC, one of my friends was talking. He thought like, wouldn't it be cool if Magic Online gave like an RC invite to the seasonal trophy leader? Like, I think that would be pretty neat, and it would like totally raise the ecosystem of Magic Online a ton. I think to actually have an incentive structure there, I think that would be really cool. But as of now,
they should do that for a standard season. Certainly,
I think that would be a great idea. It's such a low opportunity cost. It's one invite, but it would just make everyone in the leagues make it that much more popular. So it's hard for me to advocate for that as the current trophy leader. They should really be giving me something. No, but I think it's just because I play so much. So that's kind of where I'm at.
Is that really what it takes? Just like sheer volume and like having a deck that you drive with and playing it well over and over again?
You have to enjoy it. You know, I don't play Magic Online because I want all the trophies. I just enjoy playing Phoenix, and so it'll just happen incidentally. So if you don't enjoy the deck you're playing, then you know what's this all for anyway?
Getting recognized in malls, I guess. All right, I think that's gonna wrap up this week's show. Scott, you stream, you tweet. Where can people find you?
Yes, so I'm OafMcNamara on X, and I'm OafMcNamara on Twitch. And OafMcNamara on Magic Online. So if you ever want to reach out to me, Twitter is probably the best, or X is probably the best way to do that. I stream every once in a while. If you want to hop on there, say what's up. I love chatting about Magic, love chatting about Phoenix. So that's where to find me.
Chris, are you still on the internet?
I am still on the internet. I am posting at rates like far exceeding anything that I have in the past. I don't really know why, but I'm enjoying Twitter a lot lately. So
you are the eye of the storm for discourse right now.
I'm storm chasing. I don't think I'm quite the eye of the storm. Lee is the one who really got caught up in it the other day, but I'm just around making my silly little like meta posts and stuff. So at CCR_Grindcast if you're interested. I do also genuinely tweet my thoughts about Magic pretty consistently. So there's some content in there as well.
Yeah. Who knew that Lee was single-handedly flooding the economy with counterfeit cards?
Right. I was very glad when, Jerry came out on the side of the Angels there and kind of like lent support to the perspective that I and Lee share.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you both for being on the show. Chris, always happy to record with you. Glad that you were able to get back on. Scott, it was a pleasure to meet you and record with you. And I'm not just saying that because you told me you like the dive down. You were also vouched for, and I'm glad this got to work out.
Awesome. Happy to be here.
And that wraps up this week's show. If you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe to our podcast and the MTG Grindcast so you get the latest episodes of both shows as soon as they come out. And if you use Apple Podcasts, leave all of us a rating and review. We appreciate it on the Dive Down. Chris and Lee appreciate it on Grindcast. I think Scott appreciates it on both of our behalves. If you'd like to submit a question to us directly, though, you can tweet us at the Dive Down, all one word, or email thedivedown@gmail.com. If you'd like to support the show financially, you can join our Patreon at patreon.com/thedivedown or check out our store at thedivedown.com/store. Head over to heavyplay.com to get some incredible deck and dice boxes and playmats featuring the Equip Mag system. Use promo code THEDIVEDOWN2023 for 10% off your first order. And shout out to manatraders.com for sponsoring the Dive Down. Sign up for Mana Traders using promo code THEDIVEDOWN23, all one word, for 10% off your first 2 months of renting Magic Online cards. And also get some amazing shaving soaps, body soaps, fragrances, and more at Barrister & Mann using promo code the Dive Down 23. That's spelled out. That's all words and letters. The Dive Down 23. It gets you 15% off your first order. And finally, save some money on paper cards over at Nerd Rage Gaming using code DIVE8 for 8% off your order at NRG. As always, special thanks to the bands Nowhere and Spaceblood for letting us use their music. And until next week, get out there and have a happy new year!